I'm going to talk to you today about things that happened a long time ago. I'll start back in 1987. That was the year that my employer, Soil Systems Incorporated, SSI, was awarded the contract from the Arizona Department of Transportation to undertake excavations within the portion of the prehistoric Pueblo Grande village that was to become the Homecoming Expressway. This was the largest single excavation project that has ever been undertaken at the site. Back then, SSI had found a niche by conducting largish data recovery projects related to expanding Phoenix's highway infrastructure system. I will be discussing my 4 periods of involvement with the site and what I've learned as a result. The first period was SSI's field work. The second was editing SSI's Environment and Subsistence volume. The third was working on the museum's archival study. And the fourth period was contributing to a book. I'll end my talk with a final observation. This was some of SSI's staff in 1988, right around the time that the testing phase was being completed. Between January and July, we excavated over 600 backhoe trenches. I remember drawing a lot of trench profiles back then. Our first project director was John Cable. I believe that's him taking a photograph from the backhoe's bucket. Data recovery fieldwork lasted over a year from January 1989 through April 1990. We had a typical crew size of about 40, and I was one of the 4 crew chiefs. During the project, we excavated approximately 350 architectural features, 1,800 pit features, and 836 mortuary features. The great majority of everything we found dated between AD 1150 and 1350, which we divided into an early classic period and a late classic period. After fieldwork was over, I edited the project's Environment and Subsistence volume. One of the first things I worked on was completing a study about the resource potential near the site. I was trying to understand how much food would have been available nearby prehistorically. This type of inquiry is known as site catchment analysis. I used a map drawn by USGS botanist Raymond Turner to reconstruct the native vegetation. Then I drew a 5-kilometer radius around the platform mound. This is based on the ethnographic observation that agriculturalists used to spend most of their time within this distance from their home. When the original section lines were laid out in 1868, surveyors took notes on the vegetation. Based on this, I was able to reconstruct the approximate size of a large mesquite thicket or bosque. Once I understood what types of plant communities existed near the site in prehistoric times, I tried to reconstruct how many people could have been supported by 3 different types of plant resources: saguaro, mesquite, and potentially arable land. The orange area on this map is the Palo Verde Burst Age saguaro plant community of the Papago Buttes. This is probably the area where the Pueblo Grandians would have gone to harvest saguaro fruits. Information exists that allows us to calculate how many people could have been supported by saguaro given traditional O'odham Indian levels of consumption. These calculations are really an upper limit since they don't account for any loss due to predation or the fact that people living at other nearby sites would have also used the same saguaro stand. Given the inferred population levels of 600 to 700 people by AD 1150, it's unlikely that the Papago Buttes saguaro stand could have contributed any more than about 20% to the diets of the Pueblo Grandians during a typical good year. We can also estimate how many people could have been supported by mesquite given traditional Native American levels of consumption. The results indicate that the quantity of mesquite beans available likely would have been sufficient to support a per capita consumption level of 400 calories daily at peak site population levels, provided that the bosque was similar in size to the one recorded in 1868. but this would leave essentially no buffer for environmental calamities. Therefore, unexpected mesquite crop failures could have had disastrous effects for the Pueblo Grandians. Along these lines, it's important to consider two additional factors, one natural and one man-made, that may have negatively impacted mesquite yields. A streamflow reconstruction by Don Grable and Fred Niles found that the banks of the Salt River likely would have been subject to marked lateral erosion near the end of the Classic period around AD 1356 to 1370. As the river cut into the adjacent floodplain, it probably reduced the size of the local mesquite bosque. Also, the bosque would have been an important source of fuel wood since mesquite was the preferred firewood among the prehistoric Hohokam Indians. A computer simulation by Don Dove indicated that even a small group of humans living in the lower Sonoran Desert would significantly reduce the amount of nearby available firewood within a relatively short time. Additionally, I've noticed that the relative percentage of mesquite wood charcoal tends to decline at Phoenix area Hohokam sites between the early Classic and the late Classic periods. These results support the idea that mesquite resources were being stressed locally after about AD 1275. The results of both the mesquite and the saguaro catchment analyses suggest that no large surpluses of these two important wild plant foods probably existed near Pueblo Grande during the Classic period. Therefore, any events affecting either the saguaro fruit yields or the mesquite pod yields could have had disastrous effects on the health of the site's residents. Let's next consider how much arable land would have been available within Pueblo Grande's catchment. As best as I could, I tried to control for things like soil capability, the placement of prehistoric irrigation canal mains, and the locations of other Classic period sites. I concluded that about 1,186 hectares of land were potentially arable within the catchment. These results indicated that there was probably sufficient farmland for the Pueblo Grandians to grow 50 to 60% of their diet, just like the historic Akimel, O'odham, or Pima Indians did. So the potential amount of arable land was probably never a limiting factor. SSI's pollen, chard plant, and groundstone results all suggested that agriculture peaked during the early Classic, yet the physical anthropological data found that the late Classic period Pueblo Grandians were relying more on maize and that their high death rates meant that their population would have been in decline without immigration. Furthermore, the faunal assemblage indicated a shift away from exploiting traditional Hohokam animal staples like rabbits, deer, and mountain sheep and toward riparian species, especially small fish, during the Classic period. These results suggest the overexploitation of terrestrial species had taken place during the pre-Classic, and protein deficiency and subsistence stress were occurring as a result during the Classic period. These data patterns suggest that the site's residents were trying to intensify crop production throughout the Classic period, but periodic food shortages were likely occurring at the site by the late Classic. It wasn't the amount of farmland, but access to water that may have become the issue. Using the Salt River streamflow data, it's possible to reconstruct the years that had destructive floods and bad droughts. Fred Niles and others have suggested that annual discharges of 20 years or more above the mean probably would have rendered canal systems inoperable for at least part of one irrigation season. Similarly, annual discharges 20 years or more below the mean were ones with once-in-a-generation droughts. The spikes above and below the horizontal lines on this graph are the high and low discharge years that I'm talking about. We can see from this table that the late Classic period had both the highest incidence of low discharge years and the tightest grouping of high discharge years in nearly 4 centuries. The 30-year period between 1286 and 1316 in particular was bad because it included 4 droughts and 5 floods. So at the very time, we know from their skeletons that the Pueblo Grandians were increasing their reliance on maize agriculture, the Salt River stream flow became increasingly chaotic, which seems to have led directly to a decline in the health of the site's residents. To sum it all up then, the major finding of the SSI Environment and Subsistence study was that periodic food shortages were probably occurring during the late Classic period. There likely wasn't a lot in the way of wild plant foods or game animals to compensate for poor harvests. We know that the Pueblo Grandians were trying to intensify their agricultural production throughout the Classic period, but that the Salt River stream flow became chaotic during the late Classic. Riverbank erosion probably reduced the size of the nearby mesquite bosque, which was an important source of both food and firewood. The extensive irrigation canal system that began at the site, Canal System 2, may have become damaged beyond repair at the end of the Hohokam Classic period. Ultimately, we know that the existing social system collapsed. The Pima have an oral tradition that a great civil war occurred back then. Regardless of the causes, we know that there was a major reduction in population accompanied by substantial changes to Hohokam society that we recognize archaeologically as the Polverone phase. My SSI Environment and Subsistence volume was published in 1994. I completed a draft of the paper that I've just talked to you about around September 1991. A little while later, the City of Phoenix archaeologist Todd Bostwick approached me with a potential project. You see, around the time that we at SSI were doing our field work at Pueblo Grande east of the platform mound, Todd found funding to begin an archival project to report on the unpublished studies that had been previously undertaken at the site, including on the platform mound. This was great for us because all we at SSI knew about the previous work conducted at the site is that there had been quite a bit, but almost nothing had been published. Todd wanted me to analyze and write a paper on the plant remains from Pueblo Grande that were stored within its collection. Then SSI could use the information I had gathered to compare with the results we were getting from our excavations. Todd was able to hire Chris Downham for his archival study. Todd and Chris's goal was to compile in great detail all the data from the prior archaeological projects that had been completed within the Pueblo Grande Archaeological Park. Here's Chris on the left talking to Julian Hayden, who supervised a fair amount of that unpublished work during the course of several Depression-era public works projects. Todd provided me copies of the excavator's field notes for the samples that I was analyzing. The most detailed were written by Hayden in the 1930s. So I analyzed the botanical material in Pueblo Grande's collection. I also looked through the field notes and documented references to plant remains that were noted by excavators but were never collected. I analyzed both the non-woody plant remains as well as the wood charcoal. I wrote to Julian Hayden because he had correctly identified agave during the 1930s. I asked him how he knew about this plant and how he was able to successfully differentiate it from yucca. He said that because he had grown up in the desert, he had stabbed himself often enough while hiking to know the difference between the two. He further noted that some of the other archaeologists working at Pueblo Grande, people like Al Schroeder and Paul Ezel, were city boys who would have had little experience with these plants. An interesting aspect of both the Pueblo Grande archival collection and the SSI excavations was that domesticated beans were well represented. Almost all of the beans were small, so they could have been teparies, but Lawrence Kaplan has pointed out that sometimes common beans are small as well. At the time, during the early 1990s, different archaeobotanists used different criteria to differentiate between the two bean types. So I cracked open a bunch of common and Tepary beans, and I noticed that Tepary cotyledons always had one embryo leaf directly above the other, while the embryo leaves of common beans diverged from one another at their ends, giving a bifid appearance. I decided to use this as my primary criterion for differentiating the two bean types, but I did write to Lawrence Kaplan asking for his opinion. He agreed with me, telling me that he used the same characteristic to tell the two bean types apart. My friend and mentor, Bob Gasser, had previously analyzed some of the plant remains from Pueblo Grande's archives, and he had written a report about them for a Forest Service publication in 1976. The problem was a few of my identifications didn't match his, so I asked him to write something explaining the differences. He wrote an autobiographical essay about his early days doing archaeobotany, which is one of my favorite parts of my Pueblo Grande archival chapter. That's Bob in the gray suit at my wedding. In his essay, Bob explains how almost no one but he and Varsila Boer had looked at plant remains from Hohokam archaeological sites as of 1976, and so he had to rely on the opinions of some local botanists for a few of his identifications. I also noted that there was evidence for food storage on the platform mound, but I didn't see any major differences in the types of foods that were represented between mound and non-mound contexts. I completed a draft of my archival study in September 1992, and I turned it into Pueblo Grande Museum, where it remained unpublished for many years. Dave Abbott, who directed SSI's ceramic studies, decided that he would edit a book summarizing our project's results. Dave's PhD dissertation, which was based on his Pueblo Grande work, won the Society for American Archaeology's Dissertation Award in 1995. I revised my Biotic Community and Ecosystem chapter from the Environment and Subsistence volume for Dave's publication. His book was published in 2003. So I really hadn't thought much about Pueblo Grande since 2000. Occasionally I would remember the archival study that I had written, and I would think it was a shame that it never came out, especially because I liked my discussion of how to differentiate between common and temporary beans. Then, in 2017, a full 25 years after I had completed my contribution, the new City of Phoenix archaeologist, Lorene Montero, called me to say that they were moving forward with Volume 5 of the Pueblo Grande Archival Project. That's the volume that would include my study. In my revised chapter, I found that both maize and cotton remains were less common during the late Classic period in samples from the Pueblo Grande Archaeological Park compared to earlier times. This result was consistent with my previous findings from SSI's project. Archaeologists try to reconstruct the past as best as we can using the resources available to us at the time. Sometimes I wonder if all the stories we come up with are true. Along these lines, I want to tell you just one more thing. For the past 16 years, I have been the archaeologist for the Yavapai Prescott Indian tribe. One of my favorite parts of my job is to talk with our tribal elders about the old days. About a dozen years ago, one attended a meeting of fluent speakers, a meeting where they were working on named Yavapai places. He told me that the Yavapai have a name for the general area of Phoenix that included Pueblo Grande. He said that their name for this region was Mijayo, which translates to the starvation place. Now I'm pretty sure that no Yavapai elder has ever read any part of SSI's Pueblo Grande report. It's just far too obscure. They just knew, though. It's in the language, like Ted used to say.